This is Call the Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Handley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
This episode is all about interpretations. We have questions from both sides of the room. The first question comes from a listener who's a therapist. She wonders how to recover from the sting when an interpretation she makes doesn't land well. The second question is from someone in therapy with a similar problem. How does she and her therapist manage to move forward when she isn't in agreement with her therapist's observations? Listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. Well, shall we jump right in?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, this first question comes from Carolyn.
Your birthday show was so inspiring to me. Thanks for showing up in such a transparent and vulnerable way. I have a question about something I am struggling with in my practice. Sometimes when I share an interpretation with a client, they rebuff it. It stings, as I'm very careful with what I say. I know my job is to observe and reason about my client's behavior at a safe pace. And there are times when we, quote, snatch away that opportunity and instead flaunt that we know more than they know, end quote. But I am also aware that they are paying me a lot to help, and I'm careful. How do you balance this push-pull? How do you recover quickly when it lands wrong?
I wonder, so we don't make too many assumptions,
I thought that was the fun of this.
Well, there may be some...
Not too many, just the right amount,
Yeah, there may be some listeners who aren't as familiar with this part of therapy. So why don't we just start with what do we mean by an interpretation?
Do you have a definition ready?
I'll give it a try.
Okay, go ahead.
You correct me as I'm sure.
I haven't, there's different ways, but proceed.
Okay. So when a therapist comments on the meaning behind somebody's behavior or an overt emotion that the person in therapy wasn't aware of. So the real meaning was hidden, the meaning was not conscious, and the therapist has now made them aware of it. They've made them conscious of what was unconscious.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I think there's also this idea, this would be, in psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, that a full or perfect interpretation links the person's past or often childhood experience with the present and builds an understanding of how the past is influencing what's going on now, which is, in a sense, what you're saying.
Well, that's a type of interpretation.
That's a type, yeah, fair enough. But that's
a genetic interpretation.
I think that's sort of like the Platonic ideal of the interpretation or whatever.
Okay.
that you would really be able to lay it out in this really succinct way. You're doing this. You are reacting to your partner in this way because of what your mother did, blah, blah, blah.
I didn't expect to bore people just with the definition, but... You
didn't? Or did you just get bored?
No. Are we too far in the weeds already? That's all I mean.
Well, we'll find out. Okay.
Right.
But we can pull back.
Thank you. All right. Well, so with one of these definitions in mind, let's restate Carolyn's problems. She has made an observation or she's given a hypothesis about something she notices that's outside of her client's awareness. And it may be brilliant, but her client has shot her down. And she says, hey, this is what you're paying me for, but you're not accepting what I'm giving.
And that I think she's worried that she has hurt the patient or is also kind of responding maybe with a little hurt of her own.
Yeah. Yeah. It was said it.
I mean, we're going to talk about both sides of this, but go ahead.
Well, I want to say we've all been there, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So
wait, you're not always right?
I mean, most of the time.
Fair enough.
We've been there. We've been in Carolyn's place. We've been in her client's place. We felt it on both sides when it doesn't land well. And the reason we've all been there is because with a good interpretation, you've just rocked somebody's reality for a second. I mean, it's a threat to the system. And so there's that moment you realize you've been doing something the same way time and time again. And every time it gets you in trouble and you've never seen the connection before.
Right.
And so
but it can be a way to build an insight, right? And yes, sometimes I think that's really unsettling, rocking reality, as you say. I think also sometimes it can be, when it lands well, that it's a moment of clarity, right?
Yeah.
It may kind of catch the person off guard, but when the interpretation is a way where something suddenly makes sense that didn't make sense before, I mean, that's kind of the opposite, right? I think that's calming and reassuring.
Yeah, no, that's the nice version. When I think with the rejection part, sometimes I think for some people there's a moment of embarrassment that they hadn't already seen it. And so the initial response is to reject it. because how could it be that way? Yeah, I would have picked up on it by now.
Yeah.
And
fair.
then, a beat later, then it's like what you're describing, where it's like, oh, wow, that really makes some sense.
I guess, how do you respond when it doesn't land well, or when someone is really unsettled by what you've said?
I always think of several categories. One thing I think is interesting about the question is I don't feel the sting if my interpretation is rejected. So we can get into that.
Yeah,
About
absolutely.
what that might mean for Carolyn. But I give an interpretation, and it may be that I'm right, but it gets rejected. And it may just be I'm right, but just not right now.
The person has to be ready to hear it.
Yeah. So, right. That's right. The patient's not ready to hear it. They're too defended against it. Maybe they're in denial. But, even if it's not right now, you've still introduced the idea. It's in the gears, right? And they're going to work on it outside the session. They're going to mull it over. They're almost certainly going to come back to it. And you'll always get another chance. I guess that's the way I always come back to it. Is like, well, maybe this wasn't the right timing and we'll get another chance to look at it later.
And sometimes I think patients might get angry or just lower key rejected, like that's wrong. Sometimes there's a version of this where it just doesn't register. Like I feel like I've said something right or profound or whatever, and then they just keep moving like nothing happened. Right. Which is a different kind of rebuffing. But I guess I just want to point that out too, that people aren't going to hear what they're not ready to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or they're not going to accept it. There's, it's on a spectrum, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, and then the other category is that you're wrong.
Yeah.
That I made an interpretation. It didn't land because it wasn't the right one. But, I guess the reason that doesn't bother me is because it'll often spur the person to just give me some more context, to explain something a little more deeply. And then in that explanation, sometimes you uncover even better information, and then they start putting it together. So the way I summarize that is like, I was on the right track, and then we just get there together.
Right.
We get to the end result the same.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, I think there might be a third category, but maybe it's a subcategory of the second, where you are not as right as you thought you were, or it's a good guess that is close enough or something like that. I mean, not close enough, but close enough to get started. And then I think you're right. The person can say, well, part of that's right, or that's close. Here is the ways that it's different. And then you can refine your interpretation or hypothesis. And to me, that's when it really is a partnership with the patient, where together we can get to a closer and closer approximation of the truth, right? Some of it's how I see it. Some of it's how they see it.
It's a joint expedition. I always say that. I mean, in my mind.
And to me, I mean, again, I think that's almost better than, when you just say something and the person's like, yeah, that's right. But then there's kind of nothing else to say. But if we can refine it, or if there's even small parts of the interpretation that aren't quite right, then it's enlightening to me. And so I think you could, like you said, wrong time, wrong interpretation, or an okay interpretation that needs to be refined and optimized.
Yeah. I guess I always come back to we're on this together, and that part of our job is to get the person, to the client, the patient, whatever, to be similarly curious.
Yeah. And thoughtful.
Yeah. And thoughtful. Even if you're not always right, or you're close but not quite there, again, you're wanting to model some of that behavior. I wonder if this is related. I heard what you said. I wonder if it could be motivated by something else. Like, you want them to have those same questions in their own mind. And, I hear what Carolyn is saying. Like, she kind of painted maybe an ideal where you lay out the signpost, you breadcrumb, and then the person it's all about self-discovery.
Right.
And I guess that's great when that happens, but I still think sometimes you have to show people how that works. At least that's my style, especially with people who are reluctantly in therapy, like a spouse has made them go, or something happened at work and they have to go. They're really skeptical. And so, at the beginning of treatment, I'll offer lots of interpretations. And then they start picking up on how this might be helpful to them. Their heads light up, they go off, they start thinking about other things, and then we really get going. And then I don't have to work as hard.
Right. And I mean, and again, we always are saying this, it's a certain type of therapy, but if you have moved past, even someone might come because they're having interpersonal problems, and someone might come in and say, I need coping skills, or I need advice on how to do this. Like, they want an instruction manual. And again, my philosophy tends to be that the past influences the present. And so I think you're right. Kind of a lot of explanation, or really making a case for the influences that have led to the current problem, I think does take a lot of work, especially if, it's not uncommon for people to come in and say, I want to talk about this, but I'm definitely not going to talk about my childhood, right? It has nothing to do with it. And it's like, okay, right? If we can get there without that, fine, but probably not. Or probably not with me.
I think there's another big principle. Yeah, the past influences the present. And then for some people, you have to get them to buy into the idea that we do things all the time we're not aware of.
Oh, yeah.
And for some people, that's a big, profound moment.
Absolutely.
like, oh, wow, I've been on autopilot without even knowing it.
I think this is right. So, I mean, I guess, if we go back to Carolyn's being stung by the resistance or someone rebuffing it, it may be that she really is invested in being right. And I think that's something we can all fall for. Though I think it's a much more, like I said, kind of fun and creative place if you can let go of that idea. But sometimes, I guess I can relate to that in terms of feeling really confident in what I'm saying and hoping or, maybe even expecting that the patient will take it in. And, maybe they're just not that impressed with it. I don't know. And nobody likes to be refused. And I guess it just depends on how strongly the person comes back. But I think for Carolyn, it is, when she says, how do you balance it? I think it's remembering that there could be a bunch of reasons why, and that a strong no to an interpretation can be as meaningful as a strong yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's something in the question where it sounds like she's worried that if this isn't happening, if her interpretations aren't being received or resonating, then the person, they're not going to get better. Like there's
like you said,
happening.
you've planted a seed, and maybe they can even just again come back with a better explanation of what you missed or why you were wrong. And then sometimes it might be another interpretation. If I say to someone, this is about your mother and her anger and her resentment, and then the person maybe agrees, but then turns around and says a bunch of nice things about your mother, right? It's like, well, she could be cruel, but she was such a good mom and she loved me so much. And it's like, wow, I just also noticed that, you can get close to acknowledging anger at your mother, acknowledging some things she did wrong, but then you have to undo it right away.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that there are ways that it's just, I don't know. I'm sure your supervisor said this to you. Sometimes it's like not what you say, but what you say next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's it. We're in a lot of ways throwing things out there and seeing how people react. So the interpretation can be about like what's happening both outside their life, but also about what's happening in the room, right? Their behavior, their words, even the things they avoid. You might even just say, I noticed when I made an observation about it, you immediately change the subject. Is there something scary about the thing I just said?
Yeah, I think those are really good examples of how the refusal is still meaningful because it opens up other avenues.
Right. And I think just maintaining a stance of benevolent curiosity, as Jane Hall would say, right? Like that's how I make it maybe through all of this.
Yeah.
Right or wrong.
Right. No, that's me too. That's why it doesn't sting is I'm just curious. Like, hey, let's, we'll keep on.
Which is not to say that like, I don't love it when people think I'm brilliant. Right. I mean, like that, right. That feels great.
Right.
And I'll take it. Maybe that's even more of a pitfall to be like, wow, this person is really agreeable. Is it still possible that there's something I'm missing?
That's right. Yeah. You have to question how brilliant
you have to question it, right? It's like, oh God, they said I was brilliant, but they're such a people pleaser. Right? Yeah. They love to give people compliments. They don't like to challenge authority. And then I might even,
you can test that hypothesis though.
Yeah, exactly. And be more transparent about, I might be wrong. And this is some of the kind of education and instruction too. Please tell me, I have a guess, but I need your help to make it better. Here's what I'm thinking, but how can you help me elaborate or refine that?
Yeah, I had an example very recently, like yesterday, that I thought, again, just to acknowledge what Carolyn's going through. So this is somebody who almost always rejects every interpretation, at least initially. And so I just, I go ahead and give that preamble where I say, I know you're probably going to reject it, but I want us to just think about this alternative explanation. And then again, it's that conversation about why it might be true. And even if it's not, like it's probably based on some core problem that they've already acknowledged.
Right.
And then we're just seeing if this is a manifestation or not.
Well, and I actually had another example too of this woman who I've seen for quite a while. And it did maybe, I don't know, frustrate me or make me wonder when we first started, because everything I said, every interpretation, she would say, no, absolutely not. So I'm thinking, what am I missing? What's going on? What's going on? Then when I sort of calmed down and continued to listen to her, she would say no, but then the words after the no were pretty much in agreement. Right. So it's something about like, it couldn't be my idea. And so actually we were on the same page. The actual conflict or disagreement was about if I was the one being helpful, right?
Yeah.
If I had something to offer, that is the part that was hard for her, not the understanding. She needed to kind of own that for herself.
Right. I've had that happen between sessions where an interpretation is rejected, and then next week
they act like it was their idea.
Yeah, they're bringing it up, and it's their. They've already incorporated it. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, they're like, Dr. Hanley, did you ever consider? And you're like, I did exactly 1 week ago.
And so for Carolyn, yeah, sometimes your brilliance will never be acknowledged, and that's okay as long as they get what they need.
Well, and that I think, as always, it's important to pay attention to the micro and what is happening in that moment. But maybe if you zoom out and think about the whole journey of therapy, you've probably been right enough. And like I said, even listening, not getting stuck on the initial no or the initial refusal, but sometimes waiting, like with my patient, and I guess it's nice because it's like the next sentence, I only have to wait 3 seconds before I get affirmed. But sometimes it might be 3 years till somebody comes around to it. So life is an exercise in patience and realizing your lack of control.
Yeah, right.
I'm not kidding. And we're all going to die. So
that's my line.
Sorry.
All right. So I have one parting idea is that
Please.
Sometimes the kind of therapy we're offering is not the best fit.
100%.
It could be that people are not in the right state for this kind of insight-oriented work. Maybe there's a crisis. Maybe they're in acute grief. And there's some people that may not be able to strengthen their observing ego that much. I'm not saying that this is true with what she's experiencing, but I think that's always a good question to have is like, well, this might not be what they wanted to get into. Like we might need to go to a different approach. Maybe it needs to be more behavioral. Maybe it needs to be more solution-oriented. So I don't know. Insight-oriented dynamic therapy is not for everybody.
No.
In my opinion. Sorry.
Well said. No, I agree. And maybe not for everybody, and definitely not for everybody right now. Timing's everything.
There you go.
Will you accept that?
I'll accept it. All right. When we get back, we have the other side of the room with a similar question.
Dancing just you and me. Cha-cha-cha.
A big thanks to Chris for leaving us a 5-star review. He writes, as a therapist in training, I want to share how much I learned from your show. Your thoughtful answers and your humorous exchanges give me a good sense of a patient-oriented practice. Can't wait to hear more next year.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks for thinking we're funny.
It's an acquired taste.
I mean, listen.
Cha-cha-cha, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha.
Our next listener asked to remain anonymous. Hi, I really enjoy the unique perspective of your show. I find it helpful to hear advice related to understanding and appreciating the nuances of the therapy relationship in its own right. I've been blessed with a psychiatrist who offers weekly therapy rather than just med management. We've been meeting for 2 years. We have a good rapport. I'm quite guarded. This came with a lot of work on both sides. And she has helped me through so much. However, progress has slightly slowed recently. How can I gently and kindly get her to zoom out and consider the errors on her end? I'm a lot of things, but I don't believe resistant is one of them. I'm open to the therapy process, and I'm longing for change. When she gets it right, even if it feels terrible, and even if it means facing an ugly truth about myself, I recognize that she's right, and I embrace it. But when she gets it wrong, then we struggle. I can see her proceeding as though I'm resistant, and I know we need to course correct. But my attempts appear to be just interpreted as more resistance. How do we break out of this? My second question might add some context. The area where we stalled dealt with diving into trauma for the first time. In this area, she doesn't have experience personally and has very little experience professionally. She's approaching it like any other topic, and I find myself wanting to say, I don't think you've got this. I say that because the trauma doesn't feel contained, it doesn't feel healthy, and it feels out of control rather than simply uncomfortable. I don't want her to refer me, and I'm grateful she hasn't, as it's taken 2 years to build enough rapport for me to even try this. But how do we sort out what is resistance versus what is a valid concern about how therapy is going? Is a psychiatrist even equipped to deal with trauma? I'm willing to have these conversations with her. I'm just having a hard time sorting out my thoughts and figuring out how to articulate them.
There's a lot in there. I feel for this listener. Some of this, at least in the first part, has to do with the first half of the show, right? How do we proceed when there's a mismatch, when the interpretation doesn't land or is wrong? Resistance comes up. And, as always, figuring out how to talk to your therapist about these painful feelings when you want to trust somebody, when you want them to be helpful. And then it sounds like there's some disappointment and fear about how it's going. I mean, I don't know if that's a fair summary, but I'm just, as we think through how to answer it, I think that remembering that they have a good rapport, that a lot of good has come out of this, and that the trust is meaningful could be a helpful foundation as you get into these messier parts or the gray area.
I think that's a good summary. So I think if we pick up the first part, I would summarize the dilemma as, the psychiatrist has to acknowledge that she may be wrong. And at the same time, our listener has to acknowledge that her psychiatrist may be right. But the real problem is that this is all getting in the way, the scorekeeping that's going on.
Yes.
You know, who's right, who's wrong. It's like a debate team. I'm conceding a point. I'm holding on to this. And so,
good point. Yeah, it doesn't feel like that at least right now, that the listener can remember that they are together to achieve the same objective.
Yeah. So I think there could be a conversation just about that process, about the right
what are
and
we
wrong.
going for here?
I don't know if it's happening on both sides or not, but clearly for the listener, it is. Sometimes she's right. Sometimes she's wrong. When she's wrong, I have to point it out. Which is another point I wanted to make, is that the listener's doing a lot of work. Like
I was just going to say.
Okay. Yeah. She's monitoring the process. There's that line, when she gets it wrong, we struggle. I can see her proceeding as though I'm resistant and I know we need to course correct. It made me wonder if she was in the mental health field or if she just really needs to feel in control. And I say that because I used to do this in therapy. But for me, it was a way to get away from some of the feelings if I were just monitoring the process. And
able to criticize what they're doing wrong.
Yeah, you can get so tangled up because then you're thinking about what they're thinking about.
Well, I hear you 100%. At the same time, I guess I want to acknowledge that I think it is normal in, again, a psychodynamic or even just a frequent therapy to be maybe not, normal. Normal doesn't mean healthy. Common maybe is a better word, to monitor the therapist, especially if you've had trauma in your past or trauma by a caregiver or somebody you trusted. I think that kind of hypervigilance is not unusual. But I guess, the other way to frame it is that this patient is also making a lot of interpretations about the psychiatrist. And so since we're saying the psychiatrist could be wrong in her interpretations, it's also possible that this patient doesn't have it quite right when she, quote unquote, knows what the psychiatrist is doing. But if they're not talking about it and it's all happening behind the scenes, I don't think it can get worked through.
Yeah.
And that like you said, the patient feels like she needs to be right, and it sounds, or maybe in control. And so I like how she acknowledges that the correct interpretations, if you will, could feel terrible and also be truthful. And she says that she can embrace it. But I wonder what is so upsetting about the therapist getting it wrong. I mean, that there's something threatening about that can be a struggle instead of an opportunity for enhanced understanding, like we said.
I was thinking of those in terms of maybe the next part of the question, which was about when they got into the trauma itself. But
before we do that, I mean, do you have any ideas about what that means to proceed as though someone's resistant? Like, I'm not sure I had a hard time envisioning what she's picking up on.
Well, this is what I imagined. This may not be true, of course. I'm sure you had some older supervisors that just had such a hard time admitting that they were wrong. And so that no matter how off they were, it could never be anything other than the fact that the patient wasn't ready to hear it.
Oh, 100%.
That's the only thing I could imagine, is that there's this idea that, you're resistant to what I've just told you. And if you tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong, that just shows me that you're still resistant.
Oh, yeah. Right. That yes, no matter how the person responds, I guess if we were old school men, no offense, men, we would have answered that first question very quickly by saying, well, they just weren't ready. You're right. You're always right.
I tried to make a joke about this on an earlier episode. I mean, it wasn't very funny then, but it was just the idea that you're always, it's like, the arrogance of, or maybe the beauty, the simplicity of always getting to know you're right. I found it pretty hilarious sometimes.
I know. It was directed at me, but that's fine. I can take it. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's there. Or even in my own therapy, I think that there were times, maybe he just gave up because he was sick of it, but I felt very triumphant to spend thousands of dollars to browbeat an old man into admitting he was wrong. But apparently it was something I really needed. Like, I don't know.
What a gift he gave you.
Yeah, right. I mean, to really be able to convince somebody, but I can relate to the frustration of being really attached to the therapist being really attached to interpretation, or a supervisor. You're right, which a supervisor sometimes I would just ignore. That that in your heart. I mean, I've also been on the other side where I protested, and then it turns out, when the timing was right, I could hear it.
He was right all along.
Yeah. I mean, right. Like, and maybe he was even usually right, but when he wasn't, and I think that can feel unsafe, which is maybe what this listener is talking about. I think it can feel unsafe. You can feel unseen. It can feel like a rupture where you are more distant, and this person who has helped you and has been right suddenly doesn't see you. That can be terrifying. If somebody on high is handing down this interpretation, depending on how you relate to authority figures, it can feel like a punishment. You can wonder if you need to question your own reality, which is also kind of crazy making. I mean, I get how it's really unsettling, whether it's that it's incorrect or just the wrong time. If it feels wrong, in some ways it is wrong, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was a lot of possibilities, but I think we're going to kind of get into some other stuff, but I would just really wanted to validate that this experience is valid and it's tough to get through. We're going to try to give some ideas.
It sounds like there are some good segues in there to that stalemate. When they start talking about trauma, she says it's taken 2 years to get to this. And I know that 2 years can sound like a long time, but it may still be too soon. She says it doesn't feel contained. It doesn't feel healthy. It feels out of control rather than simply uncomfortable. So it could be a timing problem, like I said. It's also possible, and you mentioned this earlier about trust, it may be possible she doesn't trust the psychiatrist enough, or she doesn't have enough faith in her, at least not yet.
She's afraid she's going to be rejected, right? That she's afraid the therapist can't contain it, let alone help her with it.
She says the psychiatrist doesn't have experience. She wants the content to be approached differently. Is a psychiatrist even equipped to deal with trauma? So I guess here's how I would look at that dilemma. The psychiatrist is wrong, so you can't or you don't trust her, or is it you don't trust her, so she must be wrong? And you were kind of hinting at this earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think that point about trust is so important. Another hint at that is when this listener says that the psychiatrist doesn't have personal experience in this trauma. And I'm not sure if she means trauma in general or a specific type of trauma. But I think that's kind of an interesting and pertinent question of, how much does the therapist need to have experienced to be able to help somebody else with it?
Yeah, I thought that was weird because I thought, what amount of disclosure would have had to happen?
Right? I mean, yeah, again, I don't know, because this, as you said, the listener is doing a lot of work, making a lot of interpretations. I don't know. I don't know if they've actually talked about this, or I can imagine a way, or it's happened to me, where someone says, have you been through this? And maybe even if I've been through something similar, I think it's important to say, even if somebody's history really closely hews to mine, I think that's actually a trap. To think that, okay, we have the same medical condition, and so I know what it's like for them, or we had the same type of parent or upbringing, right? Like my stance is that I want to know really specifically, in a really almost granular level, what it was like for them. And I have to be particularly careful when maybe we have too much in common, not to make assumptions.
Well, right, because no one can ever have had your experience. Like, it doesn't matter.
And vice versa. I mean, yes.
Well, and what about the comment of she also she has very little experience professionally?
I don't know about that either.
It would be hard for her to be very successful if she hasn't had experience treating people with trauma.
I don't think you can be a psychiatrist and not treat people with trauma, even if you don't identify as a trauma specialist.
Yes, then I thought, is she wanting a specific kind of treatment or intervention that her psychiatrist doesn't offer? I mean, is it EMDR? Is it there are a lot of different modalities. And so I'm wondering if she's just saying this person isn't equipped for what I want or what I think I want.
Yeah, is she fearing judgment or punishment? Again, just kind of a fear of containment. But again, I think in this model, whatever that quote is about, whatever is human should not be alien to me. I am open to hearing about what other people went through, and I may have a framework for understanding that. But to me, that is sometimes the beauty of this type of therapy, is that the patient is actually the expert on what they've been through. And then this same idea that, the therapist is approaching it like any other topic. Again, this sounds like it's something that's particularly tender for the patient. I think that might be an attunement thing as well. There are times when someone is telling me something horrible and I might feel the horror, but I don't think it's helpful always to, cry with the patient. You can understand, you can help, you can soothe, but actually being so close to that experience that you are feeling the same thing or don't have any objectivity, I don't think that's always helpful either.
Yeah, I mean, if her bar is that she needs a therapist who's experienced the trauma that she has experienced, that's going to be a hard one to clear.
I mean, I will just say it. I would be skeptical of someone who says, I have been through the exact same thing and gives details.
Already they've lost their objectivity, yeah.
And that's part of the reason that therapists go to therapy, is to know what is your own stuff and what is your patient's, and try to not get as tangled up in that.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only advice I would have for our listener is, because she's wondering how to articulate this, I would start with her interpretations,
Yeah.
where she says, I don't think you, doctor, are right about this. And I understand that you think I'm being resistant because I don't agree with you. And then, ideally the psychiatrist would come back and say, well, that's interesting. I mean, tell me what your ideas are. What comes to mind when I make these kinds of interpretations? I wonder what else could be going on.
And maybe even be able to give some explanation. I mean, the therapist might be able to tweak her approach. But I guess I also think, as in terms of framing it, like you said, it's taken 2 years to get to this point. But diving into this trauma may require a new level of trust. And sometimes the only way to get there is to test it and prove to yourself that it was worth it or not that dangerous.
Well, I think maybe the problem is she is testing it and she's not getting to the other side.
Well, but she's also like testing it in secret, right? I mean, I'm not sure that she said any of this. Like,
oh, I see.
I feel for the psychiatrist who maybe doesn't even know that she's failing the test.
That's interesting, because I read the question differently. It doesn't sound like somebody who's going to pull punches. I don't know. I felt like, because she's been called resistant, I felt like she has been really clear that she doesn't like the way this is going. But I don't know.
I'm not sure if is she being called resistant, or does, she just believe that,
that she's acting as if she believes she, yes, I see what you're saying.
Yes.
She's too far into it. Yeah. She's acting as if she thinks I'm resistant, but she hasn't actually called me resistant. So.
Right. And so, if the therapist is making this interpretation that doesn't land, but then keeps trying to say it in different ways or get the patient to it, maybe she thinks the patient just like hasn't heard it, or she hasn't got it right, or, any of those possibilities we talked about in the first half. All the while, the patient has all these theories, which might be very valid under the surface, but if they can't talk about them, it's like, who's right, who's wrong? But again, the therapist can only really work with what you tell her. If you're just sitting there secretly thinking she's wrong, but afraid to say it, yeah, probably the therapist thinks you're resistant, but I don't know. I guess I think that part of our job is also analyzing resistance. Resistance doesn't mean that you're not working, right? It's just what you pay attention to. So dear listener, I feel for you. I think it sounds like a major point in your therapy and maybe a milestone to get into this trauma work. I hope you get what you need. I think it's worth talking about with your psychiatrist to see if the two of you can get there, because you have a really positive history. It's not clear to me that you need to be referred out or that she's thinking that, but I think also voicing that fear of abandonment would be important. And ultimately, it sounds like you're going to get through it. You have a lot of good ideas. And, hopefully it's with this psychiatrist. But if it's not, I think it sounds like you are ready to advocate for getting what you need.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. And thanks to Carolyn and our anonymous listener for the questions. If you have questions, send an email or leave an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. You can also message us on Instagram or Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. Finally, share an episode you liked with somebody. We would love for our show to keep growing. Take care.
Bye.